is more work to be done.
Director Hayao Miyazaki, man, I know you're a big fan of him. This is a very celebrated filmmaker who has gone through a couple of rounds of announcing retirement
like
or
10
maybe
times.
maybe getting a little bit ahead of himself multiple times over. I think the most recent time he announced was about a decade ago, saying that he was going to step away from filmmaking after his most recent
Hmm.
feature film. That obviously proved to not be the case. He also said that The Boy and the Heron was going to be his last feature film, but now it's already come out that he is working on his next movie apparently, and he's 82 years old, still pushing it. It just feels like he cannot tear himself away from the work of Studio Ghibli and just all these different projects that he's really spearheading. He's been just such a revolutionary force for
Hmm.
animation, especially from a Japanese perspective, and then translating it to American audiences for such a long time now. And now with The Boy and the Heron, which had its Japanese release earlier this summer, if I'm not mistaken, but is now coming across overseas to America and having an American release. It's definitely sort of in the conversation as a lot of people's favorite movie or one of their favorite movies of 2023. And so we actually checked this movie out last night as of this recording. We saw the Japanese subtitled version, not the English dub version. So just want to
Hmm.
add that as extra context for the film. But with all of that out the way, man, I'll pass it over to you. What did you think about Hayao Miyazaki's The Boy and the Heron?
So, growing up, Hayao Miyazaki in some ways has always kind of been a part of my life. This guy really is one of my favorite directors for sure. But from watching like Spirited Away on Cartoon Network, and Ponyo was on Cartoon Network, and catching Princess Mononoke, which is one of his more violent ones. That one's definitely not on Cartoon Network, trust me. This guy really has ingested like an entire aesthetic into the world. It's kind of crazy. Like you can look at a picture and be like, "Yep, that's a Hayao Miyazaki movie," and I think that's really impressive to be able to establish something like that as a director of animation. Does that make sense? Like most of the time, you say that for a studio, right? You might be able to look at a movie and say, "Oh, that's Pixar." That's a whole studio. That's not one director. Hayao Miyazaki has accomplished that as one individual, and I think that's so impressive, man. And I just recently did an entire rewatch of every Hayao Miyazaki film from the beginning to the end, all 11 films. I believe this is the 12th in The Boy and the Heron. I've been saying the Heron, by the way. It's the paid in full in me. It's just like, I don't know why I keep saying the boy and the
That pure, that white, that
Heron.
Heron.
But from Castle of Caligostro to his last one in I don't know why I keep forgetting the name of this film, The Wind Rises. I literally did a complete rewatch, and so coming into this film, I was ready. I was like, what are we looking for? What are we gonna do? And The Boy and the Heron really is this culmination and story, really about where Hayao Miyazaki is in his life. Jordan, you just talked about everything, how old he is, how many times he's retired, and that's what this film in a lot of ways is discussing and talking about. This movie is about the legacy that he's left, potentially even in some ways the lack thereof, maybe how he feels about maybe paying too much attention to his work and maybe not having enough fun outside of work, what it means to for maybe something, a legacy to be left in your lap, and you say, but you not having a choice in the matter, you not being able to say yes or no to that, what it looks like to have that autonomy, what it looks like to for things not to be perfect, what it looks like for maybe for somebody to pass away, and for you not to be yeah, just what that look, how inevitable it is. How are you supposed to sit with a lot of those ideas and concepts, man? And I think The Boy and the Heron is doing all of these things. It's very perplexing and complicated, I think, piece of work from Hayao Miyazaki. It's not as straightforward as some early films that he has. He really is speaking through so many different avenues in this film. And this movie is about a young boy who loses his mother. They relocate, and now he has a new stepmom, but the new stepmom kind of looks like his mom a little bit. He's like, oh shoot, my mom kind of looks like this new kind of stepmom, but his stepmom goes missing, and so he has to enter into this fantastical, kind of horrific as well world, trying to get his stepmom back for his father. And I think it's such a beautiful film to me because it is so scary, but it also, there's so many different remnants of Hayao Miyazaki's previous films in here that it's like, again, so somebody who just watched every movie, I was like, oh, there's some Spirited Away right there. Oh, was that Porco Rosso right there? Oh, was that House Moving Castle? Like, there's so much energy from all of his other films, and there's so much commentary for all of his other works in this one film, and it makes for such a complicated, again, body of work. But I think this new Strange World, it feels it feels like something worth exploring. At least to me, that's how I felt in watching the film. The visuals are, it's Hayao Miyazaki. You can tell it's hand drawn. There's nothing new about that. It looks amazing. The music at a lot of times is serene, but it really is a lot of the mix between what is horror and what is scary and what is beautiful in this world, for me, that draws my eye into this movie. And so you can really sit with yourself in this film and think about what this movie is about. But I think this is Hayao Miyazaki literally saying nothing is perfect, and you can have an existential crisis, you can juggle choices, but I think in some ways, Beyonce was like, you just said it, at 40, Beyonce was like, you know what? I really don't give a fuck anymore. I'm done being a people pleaser. In some ways, Hayao Miyazaki's kind of saying that same thing at 82, where he's like, a lot of that doesn't matter. I think your choices have already been made. What are the new choices that you are going to make? And for that, I think this film is tremendous. I love this film. I can't wait to see it in English dubbed. I'm hearing a lot of good things about Robert Pattinson as the Heron, but I think as an adventure film, as Hayao Miyazaki, as coming off somebody who's made 11 other really good films, if not great, some of them, I love the self-reflection that this film is doing, because he hasn't really done that yet. It's always been, what's the next thing, what's the next thing, what's the next thing? But this is like, okay, but what about me? And this movie really feels like, okay, what about me, what about my legacy, what does that mean? And so I absolutely love this film, and recommend it to any Hayao Miyazaki fans out there. What I will add, if you're not familiar with his work, I can see a world in which this movie, you're like, what the fuck is going on? Like, what is really happening in this movie? I can definitely see that. And so it is hard for me to recommend this to everybody. I can't say, oh, The Boy and the Heron's for everybody. I really can't sit here and say that, if I'm honest. And so I think that may take away from some people's draw to the film when they watch it. But again, as a fan, somebody who just finished all 11 other movies, I absolutely enjoyed this film.
So your last point was actually what I was going to start with, in the fact that before probably 2 years ago, I hadn't seen any Hayao Miyazaki movie ever. I was very new to the entire process, but I started with Spirited Away because that's the one that I heard the most
Banger.
about. It's like one of the most celebrated movies that he's ever made, one of the most celebrated animated movies ever. And I was knocked out by it. I was like, this is doing so many things right now that I've never necessarily seen in many animated feature films. And Hayao Miyazaki, I mean, a lot of his films, though it's in the animated form, I mean, he's tackling a very adult themes, very mature themes. Sometimes they do get violent. They can get scary and horrific at times, but it's not shying away from, I think, some of those more personal tales of just humanity. And that's what he's been able to imbue in all of his films that very few filmmakers or animators can ever achieve. But he does have an extremely specific style and taste and sensibility. And if you've not exposed yourself to his work prior to this, or if you are still relatively new, I could see a world in which this can be an acquired taste for somebody, because it does take a little bit of time, I think, to sort of condition yourself to understand the type of movies that he makes, the type of stories that he goes after. Obviously, the animation style, which I think is just unilaterally gorgeous across all of his movies, but he just gets better and better. But that's also something you have to adjust to as well, because it's a little bit different. One of the things that's always been really impressive to me about his art style is the characters that he intentionally makes look ugly. Like, he knows how to make something just look completely ugly and horrific and gross. Like, he's not afraid and doesn't shy away from the horrific looking nature of something, and the fact that, like, not everybody looks so beautiful and perfect and pristine. Like, some
Especially
things
old
look,
people.
especially
He
old
be
people.
going in on old people.
You see every wrinkle, every pimple, everything on their face. Like, he's not afraid to make something look a little bit more grotesque. And the Heron in this movie looks extremely unsettling at times throughout this film. He contorts and does certain things with the facial structure that are just completely weird and unsettling. But I appreciate that him about his work, because he just goes into such extraordinary depth and detail. And on a larger macro level about this movie, The Boy and the Heron, I was extremely excited about it, just because of, stuff that we've talked about, and just knowing the journey that he's been on as a director, and some of the things that he's contending with now, being in the twilight of his life, and being very reflective, maybe for one of the first true times in a long time, about his career and his contributions to this art form. And this movie absolutely speaks to that. I think that this may very well be his most personal work. And I also, explored all of his films this year and got a chance to really dive deep and understand more so what they were thematically about. And this one goes to a personal level that you don't often see. And it seems like this is not going to be the last film, but if this were the last film, it would be absolutely appropriate, because this is looking back and being reflective about, I think, sort of bidding adieu to a certain time in your life, certain ideas that you might carry throughout your life, certain ways that you perceive the world. Because a lot of what happens in The Boy and the Heron, as you sort of outline with the plot of it, it's really just figuring out and finding out how to live, and how to move forward in life, and how to accept things, and how to grow past certain things. Because the character, the primary character here, has went through this traumatic experience and he's not adapting well to the circumstances. He's not able to see a way through, and it becomes a challenge for him in both the spiritual and physical senses. And those elements about this movie are just extremely, extremely well done. I think that those are some of the most powerful things, and it might be the darkest exploration of humanity that Hayao Miyazaki has probably done, maybe since Spirited Away. Like, all of his movies have certain elements of darkness, but that movie, I remember in particular, I was like, oh, there's some really frightening stuff here. Like, there's a little girl that's like the main antagonist in that movie, and the stuff that she goes through is like, wow, that's a lot for any young person to go through. And I felt the same way about the boy in this movie, Mahito, I think his name was. And so it was a really, really powerful experience, just from a thematic perspective, and then from a technical perspective with the animation. I mean, it's gorgeous. For me, it's some of the most gorgeous hand-drawn animation that you'll see. I mean, nobody creates imagery like Hayao Miyazaki. You don't see any images in any other movies that resemble what he does. I mean, just the usage of fire in this film is beautiful.
Oh my God.
I mean, obviously, as you said, the main premise of it is that a boy loses his mother, and it's due to an incident with fire. But how that comes back into play throughout the course of the film is just, it's brilliantly done. And just the other, more fantastical creatures and characters that get introduced later on in the game, they're really interesting and funny. And I found that this movie had a little bit more comedy than I'm used to in a Hayao Miyazaki movie. Like, there were actually some really good comedic beats here. So overall, this is, I mean, for me, it was an enjoyable experience. It was really phenomenal to just understand the context of how he approached this film and what he was thematically going after. And I think that this is something that I do want to see multiple times. And I can say this really about any of his films, that if you do decide to tap into his filmography and really try to understand what he's about, I think all of his movies kind of warrant and necessitate multiple watches to really grasp what they're going after, and to really absorb everything that he's trying to communicate through the story. And this is no different. I absolutely want and plan to see it again. As you said, I want to see the English dub version to see how those performances come across and how they translate. And I can understand also for certain people, if watching this movie, how at times it does feel a little bit maybe slower. Maybe slower isn't the right word, but it feels, I think, because the movie is more pensive and contemplative, it kind of necessitates those slower, more gentler moments. Like, you have to kind of be gentle with how you're tackling this, because it is so personal to him, and he's actually putting his heart into it a lot. And so I could see how somebody could come into this and say, like, well, it didn't feel like it had much going on at certain times. I could see that as a criticism, but I do think that, again, going back and watching it multiple times and connecting the threads and seeing how the events in the beginning of the movie impact everything else that happens, I think it all comes together really, really well. And ultimately, I feel like this is something I'm gonna enjoy even more when I revisit it in the future. So it'll be interesting to see. I do want to quickly ask you, though, before we move on, this is getting critical acclaim from a lot of fans, but it also, to your point earlier, might be the least accessible Hayao Miyazaki movie. It is somewhat, divisive is kind of strong, but there are detractors who are like, this doesn't feel like what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
From an American perspective, because I think when Academy Award season rolls around, he feels like a shoo-in to get nominated. He's extremely celebrated from the Academy. Many of his movies have been nominated before. And you pair that up with a spectacular film that we saw earlier this year, like Across the Spider-Verse. That feels like the matchup. I mean, there have been
for
other
sure.
movies
That's
to come out,
absolutely it.
but that feels like the
No,
two
without
front
question.
runners for that award. Any early predictions, any early insight, just considering how people are reacting to this movie compared to a Spider-Verse and just like where we are with the culture now, with animated feature films, like any early predictions or thoughts on what that race might look like come Academy Award season?
Right now, I just think Across the Spider-Verse is too loud. I really do. It's just such a moment in time, which we know the Oscars will be like, fuck your moment. We don't care. We're gonna pick this thing over here. But I really think because it is so much more accessible. Again, these are critics still watching this because Across the Spider-Verse still in a lot of ways, I think the boy and the heron does feel like Hayao Miyazaki's Tenet, right? I think I heard somebody say that. Where like you're like, huh, this it's not as accessible. Like it is what it is. And because Across the Spider-Verse is right, it's not like some convoluted you have to watch multiple times story. Part of me feels like it's still going to get the win. I really do think that I think it's almost impossible in my mind to dethrone Across the Spider-Verse. That's how crazy I think that movie is. And it's such an ensemble too with Across the Spider-Verse. So many people, so many things involved in Across the Spider-Verse. There's Hayao Miyazaki films. Sure, there's a lot of people, but they still are operating in a very specific team when it comes to Hayao Miyazaki movies. And so I'm still betting on Across the Spider-Verse getting the real win here, but I think I still love the conversation between this Hayao Miyazaki film, between The Boy and the Heron and Across the Spider-Verse, because I still know a decent amount of people, just like you were a couple years ago, who have never seen a Hayao Miyazaki movie. So I love the energy of this big Across the Spider-Verse being in talks with somewhat smaller, Boy and the Heron in this Hayao Miyazaki film. And so I'm excited for like at least the conversation of like, oh, Hayao Miyazaki versus more than anything. But I still think Across the Spider-Verse will take the cake.
And I brought it up not to compare the two films. They are two totally different types of
Right.
stories and going after different things. But I do think it's interesting because I agree ultimately with you. I think that a potential case can be made to the fact that I believe he's only won the Academy Award for one of his films one time. I think it was Spirited Away. That might have been the only time, which, that was over 20 years ago at this point. And perhaps there could be a conversation had about the fact that this may be a swan song. Like, yeah, we suspect that he might be working on another movie, but we don't know that definitively. And of course, anything can happen in the world. God forbid anything bad happens. But if the Academy were so to award him something in lieu of the fact that this could be the end of a particular journey for a filmmaker and celebrating that moment, I could see that being a narrative that comes across for many viewers, because Across the Spider-Verse, definitely a much more accessible film. They have had their moment too, and they won for Into the Spider-Verse. So perhaps,
and there's a part two.
It's not a complete movie technically. Technically, it's not. I don't know how much that might weigh against viewers' perception and their votes, but I could see maybe a sneak from behind, which is kind of a, I don't know if it's necessarily the best term to use because Hayao Miyazaki he is such a legend, but I could see something somewhat of an upset perhaps if that were to take the award at the Academy Awards. But I do feel like those are the two front runners. So I can't wait until we do see nominations and we can start to really have those conversations and talk about what that race might look like. But folks, those are all of our thoughts on The Boy and the Heron. If you've checked out this brand new film from Hayao Miyazaki, definitely hit us up and let us know what you think.